Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to upgrade the fans on this brand new Ender 3 V2. The stock fans are 24-volt fans, and when they're all running, it makes the Ender 3 V2 very loud, especially if you're 3D printing in the same area that you live. So what we got to do here is remove these first screws here at the top. So there's two, one near the front underneath the build plate, and then another one right behind the build plate. So this is the one behind it, and then there's an additional 4 screws right on top of the power supply that you can see here. So now let's flip over the machine, cut away this wire ties, and loosen up the power supply. So there's 4 big screws here you're going to take off. And you got to be careful with this power supply because the Y stepper motor and Y limit switch that moves the bed runs through the power supply. So we're going to have to take the power supply apart to remove those wires and unplug them from the motherboard to get the power supply completely out. So on the power supply part here, there's these red and black wire here. We got to remove those. That's what gives power to the motherboard, along with the Y stepper motor and limit switch. Once those are out, then the power supply will come out. There's a little bit of hot glue on some of these plugs, so you're going to have to cut that away. Now the good thing is all these plugs are labeled. So there's a little plastic piece on there that tells you where they go. And the motherboard itself also has markings on it. So if you take everything off, you'll be able to figure out pretty easily where they all go back. So I'm just removing the screws around the power supply to get the cover off. And that's pretty much it. Now what I like to do is I like to reroute the Y-axis cables away from this power supply. That way it makes assembly and disassembly a little bit easier. Now there's 4 screws here holding this cover on. They're located on the sides. And what we're going to do is we're going to completely replace this top cover. So I have a 3D printed one that was a remix from one that I found on Thingiverse. The Thingiverse version is really big and it will not print, or at least I couldn't get it to print in one piece on the Ender 3 V2. So I split it up into 2 main sections and then added a little bracket. So this will hold an 80mm fan. And what we're going to use is a couple of Noctuas. So this is the 80mm Noctua fan, and then we'll use 2 of the 40x10 Noctuas. Now this fan doesn't bring any screws, at least mine didn't. And I'll have all the links to the exact model numbers that I'm using here if you guys want to do this mod yourself. So for the screws, we're going to grab them out of the other Noctua fan box since we're not going to use those. And they are self-tapping screws. So all you got to do is just put it on the fan and then just run it down, and that will create the threads for you. Now, one thing if you're going to add an oversized fan like this is the the feet are not going to be tall enough to be able to clear the fan. So we are going to have to elevate the machine. There's different kinds of feet that you can download from Thingiverse. One of the ones that I found kind of interesting is the squash ball feet. I thought those were pretty cool. However, most of them are designed for other Ender versions and not specifically the Ender 3 V2. Now this fan comes with 3 wires. The yellow wire you're really not going to need. That's more of a sensor wire. You can just fold that back and slip it inside of the sleeve here. And a super cool tool that I picked up recently is this wire crimper for these connectors. So this is an IWS 3220M. I'll put the link to this as well. And it's a little bit tricky to learn how to use, but it works really well once you get the hang of it. So the best way that I found to use it is just slip the connector in from the back side. And there's markings on the tool that tells you how wide the connector needs to be. So you know which one to use. So this one is it's like a 1.85. So if you look at the tool, it has a 1.9 millimeter. So that's the one we're going to use. It's the widest one on the end there, closest to the inside. And I tried loading it in from this side. That really wasn't the right approach. The best way is from the underside. So just slip it up till you see that end of the connector just touches that bottom set of jaws. And as you start to close it, it will get to a point to where it will lock. And then once it clicks and locks into place, then you can let go of the handle so that you can set your wire inside. And then finish the crimp. And when you remove the wire on the insulation of the wire, you're not going to remove a lot, maybe just like 1.5 millimeters at most. And then just slip it in there till you see the insulation goes in, and then just crimp down on it. Let me zoom in here so you guys can get a good look at it. Yeah, it does a great job. You just want to make sure that it's crimped on the non-insulated part, so it's making a good connection. And then we're just going to repeat the same process on the other wire. Now this fan that is inside the power supply is a 12-volt fan. So we're not going to need to use any buck converter or anything on it. It will just simply plug in. Next thing you want to pay attention to is how the original fan was arranged. So I'm just looking at the original plug to make sure that I get them in the right place. And what I noticed is on the 12-volt fan, the red wire is on the top here, and then the black wire is on the next to it. But when you get to the 24 volt fans, they're reversed. So just pay attention to this when you're working on these things. Again, I'm just double checking to make sure I get them exactly the same. And that's it. So now we don't need that original cover anymore. You can either toss it or save it for later. Yeah, of all the fan mods that I saw out there on YouTube, and Thingiverse is the one that I like the best. The original Thingiverse version was a narrower fan. However, I had a hard time finding the narrow fans, but this 80 millimeter by 25 millimeter is a pretty common size and works really well. It moves a lot of air. You got a lot of vents now, so the power supply is going to stay nice and cool. So another thing we're not going to need is the original metal cover that came with the Ender 3 V2. That's another thing that could be left out. And this is the second little cover along with the little bracket that's going to help hold it in place. So this little bracket will just use a couple of the slots that are on the side of the power supply. And what I did is I bought a screw kit from Harbor Freight. It was relatively inexpensive. I want to say it was about $17, and it came with a bunch of different size metric screws and the little screw organizer, and that thing has been great. Guys, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. Turn on your notification bell. Let me know what you think of the video if you found it helpful. And leave me some comments. So on this version of the cover, I left out the little screw hole. But on the STL file download that I'm going to leave in the link, I went ahead and added it. So you guys will have an easier time than I did. I had to drill mine. So we just got to drill the hole right there. And then we could just screw it down. So just reassemble it, put the 4 screws back in. And then don't forget to put the 4 screws on the other side that holds the power supply to that black cover. Now what we're going to do next here is we're going to remove the original feet. And then use the squash ball feet adapter. So these squash balls I picked up at Amazon. I'll leave the links to all of these. They're just some Dunlop yellow dots. And I think they look pretty cool. And they offer a great deal of shock absorption for the printer. So it can be moved around and works out really great. I have it on my other Ender 3 V2 and it's been fantastic. And if your end caps are stuck, you could just use a little screwdriver and lightly tap it using the slots provided in the V-rail, and just carefully pry them out. So now the side that has the motherboard, you got to take these two screws off to get that whole cover loose, because the motherboard is bolted down to it. So you won't be able to totally take it off, but you can loosen it pretty good and slip the last foot on there. Now this step is totally optional. I decided to organize these cables a little bit because it does get real crowded inside the space provided for the wiring and the motherboard. So I got here a couple of buck converters. And again, I'll leave the links to these. These are like super tiny. And what we're going to need to make for this is a, a little housing. So if you look, the original fan is 24 volts. And we're going to be using a couple of Noctua 4010s. And these Noctuas are 12 volt fans, and that's the reason that we need these buck converters. We need to turn down the voltage from 24 to 12 so that they'll work. So just pull this little Noctua fan out of its case. And again, just like the other fan, the Noctua comes with 3 wires. We're not going to use the yellow wire. So once we remove the original fan and put the Noctua in here, we're just going to tuck that yellow wire away and not worry about it. So I plan to put this buck converters on the side here where these little vent holes are. So I'm going to cut the wire to get rid of the excess. Alright, just like before, I'm going to use my little tool to put these connectors on here. And what I was doing before was I was just soldering everything, but this little tool is awesome. So if you guys are going to be doing a lot of work to your 3D printer, I highly recommend this little tool here. So again, just like before, I'm just looking at the original connector to see which wire goes in what slot. And that's it. So I was pretty much ready to go. Now we're going to need this other little pigtail here to plug into the motherboard. So I'm just going to clip it here. And then I'm going to put the female side connector on this side. So what we're going to do with this is going to plug into the motherboard using the original side, and then have a female on this side that's going to plug into our buck converters that are also going to have connections. And then run this fan. So now the female side of the connector does need to be soldered, because it's just essentially a couple of pins that come out of a little plastic Molex. And what I have inside that little glass jar there is just some copper pot cleaning scrubber that you can pick up at the grocery store. And that works a lot better than using a sponge. I found out that using a sponge is not good for a solder gun. So try to stay away from using a sponge in water. It messes up the tip. So we're just going to use the inside of the buck converter to attach this section of wire that's going to plug into the motherboard. So this is our 24 volt in. Solder these things up here. And next thing on my to-do list is to get myself a couple of little helping hands to make my soldering a little bit easier. So let's jump on to Onshape here real quick, and we'll design a quick little housing for a buck converter. I'm just going to whiz through this real fast, but you guys will get to see the process. Great thing about using Onshape is as you're designing the part, you'll start to visualize what the completed part will probably look like, and then that gives you more ideas on what to do as you're designing the piece. You know, I don't have a clear vision in my head all the time as I'm working with some of these parts, but as I'm using the Onshape tool, it kind of comes together as I'm working with it. Alright, so originally I had put the connectors and the fasteners in the wrong place, so here I'm just reorienting them on the on the other sides. And that's what I'm doing here. So we don't really need all these fasteners, we just need 2. So I'll set these things up and then get rid of the ones that we're not going to use. I'm just playing around with these fillets till I get them looking the way I want. So I'm just going to give it a quick name here, save it, import it into Cura. I'm going to turn this thing around, face it down, and then just add some supports to support the roof, and then just print it. So now we're back here to the 3D printer, and these are the 2 wires that go to the hot end. The yellow and blue is the parts cooling fan, but we're not going to be doing anything with that wire. The ones that we're going to be working with is the red and black. So you got the red and black coming from the power supply. That's going to go to our buck converter. And then the other side is going to go to the hot end fan. So here I got the buck converter mounted inside the little housing. And you may want to add a little dab of hot glue, maybe in the corner of each buck converter to hold it in there. I decided not to make a cover for the housing because the buck converter does warm up as it's stepping down that voltage. And a lot of the designs that I saw out there had lids on them, but I'm not going to cover it. Since it's mounted on the side, it's not gonna touch anything. I've also seen some people heat shrink their buck converters, which I think is a bad idea because it does warm up, and covering it with a piece of plastic just keeps it from cooling down. So I'm just going to clip off these little ends here so it'll fit nicely into my housing. And then I'm going to add the female connectors to the 2 wires that are coming out of the motherboard. So again here I'm just going to use the little female end, and the female ends need to be soldered on like before. So there it is there. And this is the side that's going to connect up to the wires that are coming out of the motherboard. Now, once you solder them up, you can use some really small heat shrink to protect the wires. I don't have any, so I'm just going to use a little bit of hot glue, and that will make sure that those connections don't come in contact with anything. Okay, so what we have to do next here is add the ends to the wires coming off the power supply. So here I've added it, and then what we're going to do now is adjust the voltage on the buck converter. So one thing you gotta make sure you pay attention to is if this is a new Ender 3 V2 that you're working on, is to make sure that the voltage selector is properly set. This one out of the box came set at 230. So I'm gonna switch it over to 115 volts AC. That way when we switch it on, everything will work properly. So here I'm getting ready to switch it on, but make sure that you got this thing set to 115 volts, otherwise it's not going to turn on for you. So I'm going to hook up my ohm meter here to the output side of the buck converter. And you can use a real small Phillips screwdriver to adjust it. Switch on the power supply. And this buck converter was already set. But you need to check them because sometimes they're running 13 volts, 14 volts, and they may not be spot on. But I'll show you guys how to adjust it. You just take your little Phillips screwdriver. Make sure that your buck converter is not touching anything metal. And then you're just gonna put your little screwdriver in there and then just slightly turn it. So clockwise will turn down the voltage, counterclockwise will turn up the voltage. And anything close to 12 volts is fine. It doesn't have to be spot on, just ballpark. And once you have it set, then next thing we're going to do is put it in its housing and then fasten the housing down and assemble the motherboard cover. Yeah, so I just snapped mine in here, but it is a good idea to put a little dab of hot glue maybe along the corners or something. Not too much, but just enough to keep it from coming out of there accidentally. And the good thing about mounting them next to the cover is that when the motherboard fan kicks on, it will also offer cooling to these buck converters. So here I'm just trying to figure out exactly where I'm going to place them. The spot that I have the most room is towards the front on the side. So that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to use these slots here. And what I found the best way to do this is to thread the screws into the plastic first before trying to mount it, because these screws are a little bit on the long side. If you have shorter screws, those will be better. These are the ones that I have that are the right diameter, but they are a little bit long. So threading them in first will make it easier to install onto the side of the cover. Now once they're all fastened up, we're going to make our connections. for me, the best way was to route this wire around the fan to try to remove as much slack as possible. And then make the connection to one of the buck converters. The two wires that are left to be connected are the ones that go to the hot end. So we'll just set up our crimper tool here, add those wires, and lastly add our plastic housing. So again, we're just going to double check to make sure that we have the wires coming in the right position. And then lastly, make our final connections. So it goes from the motherboard to the buck converter, and then from the buck converter outside to the side that goes to the hot end. So this is the motherboard side here. So this is the input for one of the buck converters. And then that first connection that I made was the one that went to the hot end fan. So this final plug here plugs directly into the motherboard where the original motherboard fan was connected, and that goes to the inside of the buck converter. So now we're just going to organize these wires a little bit and fasten the lid down. So there it is, all buttoned up on the bottom. You can see it looks real neat. And it's best to do this now before you assemble the rest of the printer, because once you have all the hardware installed on the other side, it makes it more difficult. Now, in this part of the process, what we're doing is replacing this final heatsink cooling fan with the Noctua. So we already have the buck converter installed, so it's ready to go. All we're doing now is just installing the fan. And like before, this is a 3-wire fan, but we're only going to need the red and black wire. So once we remove this insulating cover off of here, we're only going to use the red and black wires. I'm going to go ahead and put connectors on the end of these wires in case I need to work on the hot end assembly again. I'll just simply be able to unplug the heatsink fan easily. And eventually what I'll do is I'll also add a set of connectors to the parts cooling fan. That way taking apart the hot end assembly will be much easier. And I have a whole video on the complete assembly with all the upgraded parts that I have installed on my first Ender 3 V2. Make sure to check out that video if you want a complete assembly guide. This is what it looks like all put together. As you can see, it looks real nice and neat. I love the look of the squash ball feet. All right, guys, so how quiet did it get? So I'm talking right now, so I'm going to stop talking. But this is with the parts cooling fan running at 100% and just the Noctua fan on the heatsink cooler, the motherboard fan, and the power supply fan running. So this is a quick slide here to give you a visual reference of how quiet it is. So we're at the upper level of a quiet room. Huge improvement over the stock form. Make sure if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Leave me some comments. Make sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel. And turn on your notification bell. That way you guys know as soon as I put out new videos. Thanks for watching. God bless.